Hey, welcome back, faithful politics listeners and viewers. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and unfortunately, your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram, can't be with us today. But instead, we have with us Steve Phillips this week. He is a national political leader, best-selling author, and columnist. He's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Brown is the New White: How the Demographic Revolution Has Created a New American Majority, and the newly released national best-selling book, How We Win the Civil War: Securing a Multiracial Democracy and Ending White Supremacy for Good. He's also a columnist for The Guardian and The Nation, and an opinion contributor to the New York Times, and is the host of Democracy and Color with Steve Phillips, a color-conscious podcast on politics. So welcome to the show, Steve.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, and Steve, I wanted to kind of just first start off by acknowledging and offering our condolences to the passing of your wife, Susan Sandler. She is a person who I was unaware of actually prior to having you on the show, but a person I'm glad to have gotten to know better by reading about her accomplishments and advocacy for social justice. But I did want to give you an opportunity to tell our audience a little bit about who she was as a person, and then maybe talk about how you're continuing the work that she started.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much for that. And that's the picture of her over my shoulder. I put on Facebook after she passed a picture from our wedding and said, so what we had was a love story for the ages. We transcended barriers of race, class, and religion, and found each other and forged a life and set about trying to change the world. And she was very passionate about social justice. She was a white Jewish woman who was very passionate about social justice, racial justice, economic justice, and that really is what bonded us. And really used all of her position and status and privilege and power in the world to try to bring about greater equality. Her family were very successful business people and philanthropists themselves. They helped to create Center for American Progress, ProPublica. And so she became a philanthropist herself, helped to create the Learning Policy Institute, was a real leader in education, educational equity work, and so also created a Susan Sandler Fund, which is a racial justice focused philanthropic fund that invests primarily in civic engagement organizations run by women of color. She had written a Medium post about her philanthropic philosophy, which was really about power over persuasion and changing the people in power more than trying to change their minds. She was the first and largest donor in 2007 to Barack Obama. She was the first donor to Stacey Abrams in 2012, 10 years ago. And so I think that's reflective of the work that she had done, is partnering with, empowering, and connecting with people of color working for social, economic, and racial justice. And that is the legacy she will leave. And that's what I'm trying to carry on to the best of my ability.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I guess what was the catalyst for you to become so active in social racial justice?
Yeah, well, that's also, frankly, why I was, excited to join you on this podcast. And so, it's a combination of a lifelong intrinsic interest in electoral politics and a lifelong connection to an interest in civil rights, and all of that in the tradition of the progressive faith-based work. And so I grew up in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. I like to say I was literally a child of the civil rights movement. Is that we were the first family to live on our block, Cleveland Heights. We desegregated the neighborhood. They would not sell the house to my parents in '64 because they were black. You had to get a white civil rights lawyer, Byron Krantz, to buy the house and then deed it over to them. My mom slept in her clothes. She was afraid the house would get firebombed. And my brother was the first black student in local elementary schools. And one of my first memories was going to see Martin Luther King. My dad took me to see Martin Luther King when I was like 3 or 4 when he came to Cleveland, Ohio. So I had that. And then, kind of the civil rights piece always, I read all the biographies of Martin Luther King in the local elementary school. So I had that kind of background. And I always had an intrinsic interest in electoral politics. I think that some people are like into gardening. I was into electoral politics, right? And my next door neighbor, Art Brooks, ran for state legislature when I was like 8 years old. I remember going to the victory party next door and kind of like getting the bug about electoral politics. And then all of that in the context of particularly the black faith tradition. And so my grandfather was a minister for 50 years at Glenville Church of God in Greater Cleveland. My parents were both involved in Church of God. They met at the Church of God campground in West Middlesex, Pennsylvania. And that was always a big part of my upbringing as well. So you take those strands of, faith-based family and tradition, civil rights movement, and electoral politics. And so that when Jesse Jackson ran for president in '84, I was 20 years old, and it spoke so deeply to me in terms of all of those different elements. Until you have somebody who was there with Dr. King at the time that he was killed and has carried on that tradition, running for president in terms of the electoral piece, and then all of that wrapped in religious and faith metaphor and language. It just spoke to me very, very, very deeply, and particularly as a 20-year-old, really galvanized my, like I say, I've been trying to build a small R rainbow ever since.
That's awesome. It's interesting because, so I was never really close to my dad, but my dad was born in 1928 in Oklahoma. And, I've kind of gone through sort of this round of genealogy stuff, and like it's super difficult, especially if you're a person of color, to try to like trace your genealogy. But like, there are certain points along his life where I'm like, man, I really wish he were around. He's passed since, but I really wish he was around because I'd love to ask him about, like the Tulsa massacre or, some of these other events that he would have remembered. Right. And he would have been alive for. And, he married my mom, I think early 70s or something like that. My mom is an Asian woman, so she was born in Vietnam, and he probably would have had some of the same difficulties that you're speaking of. And it's weird just to kind of hear you talk and also just to, for me, just to kind of relate that my dad might have gone through something similar, but anyways, changing the topic, going to Martin Luther King, he reminds us, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I'm curious on your thoughts about that, because it seems, that arc is more like a horseshoe, at least now. And according to, political science and popular discourse, there's this idea called the horseshoe theory, where it's almost like you go so far left, you go so far right, and they're basically the same thing. It's like, Republicans talking about, being very anti-Russian or, and whatnot, and anti-war. And it's like, that's sort of the sentiment that those on the far left had, several decades ago. So I'm curious on what happens when the arc of, the moral universe becomes a horseshoe, or maybe there's an argument that it's not really a horseshoe. It really is just like a rainbow or an arc or something.
Yeah, I would argue more that it's not a horseshoe, or at least it has not yet been a horseshoe. I think might be a way to actually put it. That and so I root this, latest book. My fundamental premise is that the Confederates have never stopped fighting the Civil War to this day, and that is continuing on. And so I went back through all these different parts of history to really be able to look at and understand and make that argument. which puts the current moment in more perspective. And then in January, I had the chance to go to Virginia, went to Richmond, Virginia.
Oh, that's where we're at.
What's that?
I said Richmond, Virginia is where we're at.
Oh, you're in Richmond?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So I was there in January, and then we went to the library, and they have all of these original documents from the Civil War period. They've got a register, handwritten register of people being sold and what their names were and how much they were actually sold for. And so just as well as looking at the newspapers, which was fascinating to me. So you see the newspapers after Lincoln's election, as I try to make the point to describe to people that the Civil War didn't start out as a Civil War. It started out with seceding from the Union. And the seceding from the Union began after a presidential election in which the candidate backed by black people won, and the losing side refused to accept the results. And so when you look at it that way, you start to see this. But fundamentally, we used to literally be in slavery, and we were sold on the regular, and they would just write down the names in a ledger. And I've seen that. There were regular lynchings where they would drag people out and string them up from trees. And that was just part of how this country functioned. And when you look at it in that context, as bad as things are or get or that we face, it's not that. And so you combine that as well with the, I think we underappreciate the accomplishments that we have made. And so the full arc. And so you look at Georgia, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise in 1877, which basically gave the South back to the slave owners, was brokered by the senator from Georgia, John Brown Gordon. So then you take that, kept us in subjugation for almost 100 years. And it was a civil rights movement led in part by Martin Luther King out of Georgia. And then in 2021, the pastor who preaches in the church where Martin Luther King was the pastor, Ebenezer Baptist Church, Raphael Warnock, runs for and wins the seat in the United States Senate, that same seat that had been the one that had brokered the abandonment of Reconstruction, and in the process flips control of the entire United States Senate, so that then trillions of dollars can go out to the American people in terms of investment and COVID relief and climate and all these different pieces. So when you look at it in that sweep, I see it as an arc still. I don't think that there's a lot that's intense and bad, and there's a lot that's dangerous in terms of the moment that we're at. But I still feel like that we're in a profoundly better place than we've been historically.
Yeah, that actually makes me feel a little bit better because, like, when I look at the political landscape, especially as it applies to people of color, you're seeing things that just makes you want to, like, it's like the face palm emoji. You're like, what the heck? Especially when you hear conversations about CRT. I mean, personally, I feel a lot of the people that use the term CRT don't have a clue of what it really means. And we did a whole series on CRT. We brought in some professors from Yale and Berkeley to talk about it. And we even brought in some counterpoints, like this gentleman by the name of James Lindsay, just to kind of make an argument to kind of just balance the conversation a little bit. And, when we see things like what's happening in Florida, they're banning certain subjects, from an AP African American studies curriculum, like exploring Africa's geographic diversity. Like, okay. So like, I'm curious on, what are the ramifications of that, maybe short-term and long-term, on sort of the body politics, and even just for people's awareness of what, minorities, have to endure in this country.
Yeah, well, I think first it's important to understand, again, none of this is new, right? That it was illegal to teach enslaved people to read. Right? So we typically look at that context. there's been a long, uninterrupted, and I talk in my book about there's this consistent Confederate battle plan and with multiple components, and one of the components is distort public opinion. And so they have entirely and successfully, I would argue, rewritten the history of the Civil War and of the Confederacy. And that, as part of that effort, most prominently is the writing and then making the movie Gone with the Wind, which entirely transformed the conception of what was, in fact, white supremacist mass murderers and transforming them into dashing leading men and attractive leading women in this movie that people feel so good about it. And so all of that is about the glorification of white nationalism and the preservation of this concept that this should be and is fundamentally a white country, and everything else is illegitimate. And so that has been that's the essence of these attacks on CRT. It's not they're attacking CRT, they're defending the concept of that this is a white country and the efforts around white nationalism and, frankly, white supremacy. The very first immigration law in this country in 1790 said that to be a U.S. citizen, you had to be a free white person. And that was good law up until the 1950s. And it was, in fact, the practice of the country until the 1960s when the Immigration and Nationalization Act was passed in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement. So all of this is a piece. And so this is just the latest wave of these attacks. I think the biggest danger is the miseducation of white people who will not understand the bases and the nature of inequality to the extent that people benefit from and are complicit in a system that perpetuates this level of inequality. But this country is 41% people of color. And this is the point I was trying to make in my first book, Brown is the New White. And there is, and has always been, a meaningful minority of whites who want this to be a multiracial country. And so you take that grouping, which is around a third to 40% of whites, and connect that with people of color. That's the majority of people in the country. And so all these attacks, I don't think, are going to have much impact on that constellation because people want to know their own history. People want to see their own stories reflected. We saw this with both the success and then the enthusiasm around the movie, or different movies, Black Panther, Everything Everywhere All at Once. People from these communities want their stories told, and they want to understand their histories and stories. And, I feel like this is, aggressive, but I hope ultimately futile attempts to suppress the true multiracial reality of this country and its history.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, with the death of George Floyd, for me, it seemed like a moment in history that, I don't know, like separated the wheat from the chaff, in the sense that you really got a chance to see where people are at, kind of along the racism spectrum, if you will. Because, I had people, I don't know if this is the same with you, but I had white friends that would send me texts or messages or emails or phone calls saying, oh, okay, like, we get it now. We get it. Like, what can I do? How can I be an ally? And for me, it was like number one, it was just weird because I'm like, I don't know, like, vote, just vote for people that, believe in social justice, racial equality. And it was just, I don't know, it was shocking. Like, even my co-host, that couldn't be here, he even was like, he put up stuff on like his social media, like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, and he got attacked. I mean, my co-host is a white guy, who has a family lineage that dates back to the Confederacy. Like, it's something I'd love to give him crap about all the time. But even, he got attacked as a white guy because people in his congregation are like, what are you doing? Like what do you know, that's a terrorist group, like you can't put that stuff on your social media. I'm not going to your church anymore. So I'm curious to kind of get your take on the importance of that period of time when the world, I should say, actually was recognizing that social justice is so important.
Yeah, no, it's I need to find out which comedian was it. Was comedian on Netflix and those YouTube clips, right? Netflix is a joke, and he was saying, says, the bar is so low because all we're saying is Black Lives Matter, just that they matter, right? And so, but that's so controversial for people. What is the opposite? That they don't matter, right? And so, is that really what we're having a conversation about? So, I think that from a optimistic standpoint, and less cynical standpoint, it did reveal the breadth of potential support for racial equality. And so, and it's interesting, if you look at the whole sweep of history. So there's always been close to a consensus that racism is wrong. But the problem has been that nothing is ever considered racist, or like what people would actually, and that Ta-Nehisi Coates had this essay he wrote where he says in this is, who does the guy have to lynch around here to get called a racist? Right? And you see it in the Supreme Court in all these different, and so we passed 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, ending slavery, calling for equal protection, calling for the voting rights protections. And then the court narrowing down, say, yeah, you can't do that, but it doesn't apply here, and it doesn't apply there, and it doesn't apply to public transportation where you can have separate but equal. And so it's the same kind of dynamic as that. And so I think the number of people who are willing to entertain that systemic racism exists was expanded at that time period. Because first of all, how can the power of the video evidence was visceral. And I think that's what galvanized and tapped the best in people and allowed that to come out and flourish. And there was a poll the New York Times had, I think it was by CIFIS Analytics, they'd done showing support for Black Lives Matter by racial group. And it peaks in like June, July 2020, after the killing of George Floyd. And it's somewhat gone back down as well. So that's the more sober reality of it, is that the duration of that commitment and interest has waned fairly quickly. And so you have all these different corporations and foundations who have made all these grand pronouncements around, we're going to do this, $100 million anti-racist philanthropic initiative. And then a number of them have fallen by the wayside or not happening or been watered down, et cetera. And so that's the more sober part of it. But I guess big picture, it suggested the potential pool of support for this concept that this is a multiracial country, for the issue of ending or addressing systemic racism is potentially bigger than we may have thought, but it's also can be fairly fleeting.
Yeah, and you brought up something that I think I've personally struggled with, where how do you define racism? Because it seems like that there's a lot of people that would say, oh, sorry if you hear my dogs in the background. There seems to be a lot of racist adjacent type of behavior, but to call somebody straight up racist, it seems like you got to have all these qualifiers to, it's like, oh, okay, well, they said this. Okay, check. Okay, they did this, check. Oh, they believe this, check. Okay, yep, that is 100% racist. And I don't think that really exists. I mean, so I grew up in Southern California. I went to public school in LA. When I was in third grade, I had a teacher ask the class, like, what do we want to be when we grow up, and I remember a lot of the students, and it's weird, it's like this moment has been seared in my memory. I don't remember anything else about third grade, but this one moment, kids in the class were like, yeah, I want to be an astronaut, I want to be a doctor. I remember saying I wanted to be president, and the teacher said, you can't be president because you're black.
Wow.
And at the time, I was like, oh, okay, like, well, the teacher said it, like, and I didn't have a framework, or I didn't have a place to really put that. Just that, okay, she's the teacher, and she told me I can't be president because I'm black. I didn't even understand the concept of racism in third grade. So, but that carried with me for years and years and years until, like, probably in my college years, I started thinking back, like, man, that teacher was really racist, like, and then Obama, got elected. I'm like, maybe there's hope, someone looks like me in the White House. So like, is there a way to better identify racist behavior or define what racism is aside from lynching?
Yeah, it's it's interesting at that point you make. So when Obama won the Iowa caucus in January 2008, and he came out, and I'll use this phrase as the title of a chapter in my first book, Brown is the New White. In his first words in that speech, says, they said this day would never come. And that it's because of this piece around, people always thought that there would never be a black president. So I remember when, like, a formative experience for me was the Free South Africa movement in the 1980s. And I remember Mandela being freed from prison, and then him doing a national tour. He came to the United States. I went to see him speak in Oakland. But he was on Nightline with Ted Koppel. And Koppel says to him, well, tell us about some of the indignities that you faced in prison. And that's the only thing I remember from this interview. It's one of the few things I remember. And he says, the indignities are a diversion. And that really resonated with me, because I think fundamentally, and I've used this line somewhat flippantly, that, if I had my 40 acres and a mule, I don't care if you call me the N-word, right? And so that issue around economic justice and economic equality, I think, is far more fundamental than the indignities, the individual interactions, etc. There remains a gargantuan racial wealth gap in this country, where the average white family has close to 10 times more assets than the average black family. And then in many, if not most cases, white high school graduates do better economically than black college graduates. That, to me, needs to be the focus, because we only have limited time, energy, and effort, in one's life anyways. And so more so than trying to get different individuals to act better, which they should, I'm far more interested in this question around what are we doing to address the racial wealth gap and to pursue economic equality and justice. And then I think it'll be less impactful, the different, indignities that we face from different individuals. But the fundamental point is, how do we strengthen the economic position of people in the country?
Yeah. So racism is it a problem to be solved, or a problem to be aware of, that has a lot of different levers you have to pull to keep it from, ending up, where we're owning people again?
I would argue to be aware of, in that, and even if you think about the Civil War and Reconstruction and the aftermath, so it wasn't just a question of being mean to black people. I mean, it's a question of owning black people, stopping that. Yes, you don't want that. But they moved on to 40 acres and a mule for economic sufficiency, to creating free public education so people could actually be educated, to creating public health care so people could be healthy. So it's creating a lot, getting people of all races, although it took a while to bring down the gender line, to be able to vote. So creating a multiracial democracy. Those to me are the goals, but in a country where there's such a profound persistence of white nationalism and white supremacy and white fear and resentment, you have to be race conscious. So it's something to be aware of as we move forward, trying to create a multiracial democracy. Even talk about, Rosa Parks. People talk about, Rosa Parks, wanted to be able to, for Black people to ride the bus. But that actually wasn't Rosa. It wasn't that Black people should be able to ride the bus. It's so that everybody could be able to ride the bus. Mm-hmm. And so the obstacle we faced was the whites only policy, but taking that down made it available for everybody. And that, I think, is how I think about the challenges ahead of us, is race conscious pursuit of opening up the society to be a true multiracial democracy.
That's good. And I'm wondering, like, how do you raise, the race consciousness of, whites or others, to the degree that it will lead to action? Because I feel like, when Trump got elected in 2016, there was a lot of people I know that were wondering how the heck could this happen, citing a lot of Trump's racist rhetoric and whatnot, but when I speak to some of my Black friends, they're not surprised, just like me. I'm like, yeah, of course he got elected, like, and I wonder, like why do so many Americans feel like racism still isn't a problem in America when it clearly is?
Well, I think it's a combination of, like I was saying about the distort public opinion piece, right? That there was such a profound effort to sanitize and whitewash the white supremacist history of the country, as well as to just outright celebrate it in terms of all these Confederate monuments, which are still. I went to the Capitol, and I was out in East in January. I went to the Capitol. I did a short little video on Instagram of these still have these monuments in the rotunda of the Capitol to Confederate white supremacist mass murderers. And they greet you when you walk into the Capitol.
Yeah.
And so that gets at this piece. And then there's so much the breadth of the insecurity and kind of backlash when you kind of point something out or raise it. It's very ferocious from people in all of these different positions of power and influence. And so it reinforces the view that racism is a thing of the past. It doesn't exist. Like even in the Professional Basketball Associations, one of these Black ESPN reporters says that raises the issue that perhaps the people are partial to Denver's center because he's white over the Philadelphia center who is Black, and makes that explicit. All hell breaks loose. So if you point out something, people have this immediate reaction. No, it's not that. There's other things, etc. And so that is so visceral for people, and it makes it very hard, which is why the George Floyd thing was so powerful, because it was like the one example we'd had in a very, very long time that you can't excuse away. But everything else gets excused away. So then people think that the racism is a very, very rare phenomenon in terms of manifesting itself, as opposed to a regular phenomenon where you can't, where the top the top Black football offensive coordinator cannot get hired to be the head coach every single year, and all of these objectively lesser qualified whites get hired, but that's not racist. So anyway.
Yeah, it's like Speaking of comedians, I feel like this is Dave Chappelle or somebody similar, but there was this skit about the new Little Mermaid, and how the new Little Mermaid is black, and
Mm-hmm.
how it was. I mean, it sparked a lot of outrage from
Right, right,
from
right,
people
right.
that are used to just seeing a white Little Mermaid, and this
Mm-hmm.
comedian's like, really, like that's the thing, that's upsetting you, like like she's still a mermaid, she's still
Right,
little.
yeah, yeah, I saw that. It's like, so the fact that you have like this human being under the water breathing, that's all like
Yeah.
believable. But the fact that they're black, that's what we're upset about.
I was like, man, and like I do feel that at least in Virginia, that there have been some strides to right wrongs, for better for worse. Ralph Northam, Ralph Blackface Northam, like he, whether it was just like an apology tour or whatnot, but he really made an effort to get all these monuments down, which I can definitely applaud him for. And Congress, has passed bills to rename certain military installations. So the one closest to me is Fort Lee, and I remember I spoke with Congressman Donald McKeechin shortly before he passed, and he was pretty instrumental in renaming it to Fort Greg Adams. He knows, I think the general, I think it was Greg, and and I was asking him his thoughts about it, and he's like, yeah, it's time, because it's Fort Lee, named after General Lee, and everything it represents. And here we are, a military installation that is praising the atrocities that this person committed. And, I'd love to get your thoughts on, changing the names of army bases, if that's significant, or is that, as you mentioned earlier, maybe just a distraction?
Well, it's both. It's not insignificant. It's not as significant as economic justice and equality, but it's not insignificant. So we had on the um, podcast on the what was this 2 weeks ago, 30th, 23rd, six things, March 16th, Jennifer McClellan,
Mm-hmm.
who replaced that congressman
Mm-hmm.
and who is the first black woman to represent Virginia. And so we closed the podcast talking about these monuments. And so that Robert E. Lee monument statue, which had been in Richmond, was like, what, 3 stories high,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
which went up 30 years before the Lincoln Memorial. It was
Yeah.
a very deliberate attempt on who they were, and they blocked the creation of Lincoln Memorial for as long as they possibly could. So she said she lived around the corner from that Robert E. Lee Memorial, and that she didn't even realize or appreciate until it came down how much of a weight it had been.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the things I try to illuminate in my current book, is talk about what are these monuments doing there in the first place, and how they pollute our public spaces, because they're testimonials to mainly white supremacist mass murderers,
Mm-hmm.
and we're celebrating them. So it both elevates and affirms that level of superiority, and then people of color have to deal with that and face that every day. Right? There was a thing in Yale, right, where they had um, the stained glass windows that perpetuated these stiffness, and this one black worker couldn't take it anymore, and so he took his broom and he broke the glass. Right, and so these things matter, and so I think we need to address them, and I think it's also helpful to do so explicitly, is to challenge people and to force people to confront the reality of these issues, what these things stand for, and to make them go on the record around renouncing them. And that I talked to somebody, I don't know if it's on this in my book as well, who was from Germany, and she had come to work in the United States. She worked at this organization, Ashoka. And she was talking about how their first of all, there are no monuments to Nazis in Germany.
Hmm.
And there is a sense of national collective shame about the Holocaust. And she was pointing about there's not shame in this country. People do not feel sorry or regretful or anything wrong happened, etc. And so I think not just renaming these things, but doing so in a public and educational fashion helps to ultimately build support and understanding for a public policy agenda that gets at the legacy of that kind of racism and discrimination.
Yeah, I can relate. My wife, who's white, actually, she actually majored in German studies and lived in Germany for several years. And her and I have had discussions about this, especially around the time of the monuments. And she said the exact same thing. She was like, "Yeah, no, like there is no promoting anything the Nazis did in Germany. Actually, like it can get you arrested." you
Right.
know? And so I do wish that that was the same here. And and I should note, I did recommend to Donald McEachin that I could have saved the military a ton of money, because I had recommended that we just renamed it Fort Stanley after the creator of Marvel X-Men stuff. I said, man, you wouldn't have to spend a dime. Like Fort Stanley, just keep the Lee. Anyways, but nobody listens to me, So um,
We did a school report when I was in the school board in San Francisco. They wanted to rename. We did rename a school that was named after. It was called Douglas, and it was actually named after like certainly a white general.
Mm.
And then the people who didn't want to rename it, they kind of say, "Oh no, it's not. It's named after Frederick Douglass, not after this white general." But the names were spelled different.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, just trying to save money where we can. But yeah, so I'm curious about political parties and blacks affixing themselves to specifically like the Democratic Party. I mean, I don't know, 60 years ago, you probably wouldn't have seen a whole lot of blacks subscribe to Dixiecrats or Democrats or what have you. But it seems like today Democrats really kind of symbolize or at least promote social justice more so than the Republicans. And I'm curious on, like, why is that? And then maybe kind of as a second question, like, what are your thoughts on Black Republicans? Because there are, quite a few of them. I mean, there's like Byron Donald, who's the congressman out of Florida. And that's sort of one sort of category. Then you've got like the Michael Steele, who's also Republican, but I would say he's sort of cut from a different cloth. So can you talk a little bit about like, race and the two political parties, why one seems to cater better than the other?
Yeah, I think that the best way to understand it and describe it actually is to look at the political parties and their relationship to white people. And then I would argue then that the behavior of black people is in response to that.
Hmm.
And so that originally the political party that went to war to defend the right to buy and sell black people and hold us in slavery were the Democrats. And the Republicans were created largely, in large part, as an anti-slavery party. And Lincoln was, a Republican. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. There was largely progressive Republicans who drove the Reconstruction legislation. So I think that's an important context to understand, is that the party of white nationalism was originally the Democrats. And then, as I use this phrase in the book, that as Democrats began to tiptoe towards embracing civil rights and racial equality, Southern whites sprinted to the Republican Party. And there was a very conscious effort on the part of the Republicans to woo the white nationalists and to woo whites who were afraid of what was happening within the country. And so Truman supported the Civil Rights Act in 1948, which outraged the white nationalists. And so that's when the Dixiecrats, so Strom Thurmond, the predecessor to the current South Carolina senator, Strom Thurmond ran as a Dixiecrat, really to punish Truman for supporting the civil rights movement. And it was, but he was a splinter of the Democratic Party, and largely the Southerners that were unapologetically pro-segregation, which meant being pro-white nationalist. And so you had that, and then Strom Thurmond explicitly led the exodus out of the Democratic Party in the 60s and cut this deal with Nixon in 68 and says, I will, to Nixon, I will vouch for you with all of my pro-white supremacist credibility if you kind of give me influence and power in your operation. And so he did. He went around and he told all of the different folks that Nixon and the Republicans were on their side. And then that culminated, I would say crested, in 1980, when Ronald Reagan got the Republican nomination, launched his general election campaign in Mississippi, in the very county where Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney had been killed, the civil rights workers, in 1964. And he used the phrase of how he supports states' rights, which was, code words and language for white nationalism. And so Reagan sent the very strong signal that the Republicans were the home of white nationalists and people who wanted this to be a white country. And then Trump took this to a whole other level. So in that context, I would argue that black voting, which remains 90% supportive of Democrats, is frankly more of a reaction and a recognition that the Republicans are the home of white nationalism. It's like, well, we're not going to go over there. And I fundamentally think that most Democrats remain too timid and fearful of too closely embracing and aligning with African Americans in general, and then a public policy agenda that deals with racial equality within the country. We cannot even pass a bill to study the question of reparations, not to give anybody reparations, just to study what is owed to black people for centuries of creating wealth that was taken by whites. And we can't even pass a bill, and then the president won't even create a commission to study it. It doesn't require any vote at all. And so the timidity, so in that context of fear and timidity and tentativeness on the Democrats' part, it's clearly not that the Democrats are so strong that that's why black folks are voting for them. But black people are very clear that the Republicans are pro-white nationalists, and it's a reaction against that. And then black Republicans, I don't know. I mean, it's like, it's black people sold black people into slavery. Black people didn't want to leave the plantation. Malcolm talked about house Negroes and field Negroes. And so there's always been some small percentage of black folks who are aligned with the system that was oppressing our people. So I think the expectation that we would have 100% agreement. 6% of black people voted against having the country's first black president. So, on the one hand, I'm curious what was going through their heads. I used to say, are you waiting for the next black president? In terms of, but it's never going to be 100%. But I think the fact that you have 90% of African Americans voting consistently Democratic is a very lasting and profound statistical reality.
Yeah, it's so true. And I'm curious. You bring up President Biden or President Trump, but I'm curious about Obama and whether or not he missed an opportunity to help Americans engage with sort of our racist background, our racist history. Because I remember when he got elected, I was super stoked, very excited. I still think he was a good president. I mean, he did some things, I'm sure that, I would have been upset if another party president did it. but but I think the good outweighed the bad, in my opinion. I mean, I'm a Democrat, so like you probably expect for me to say that, but I do think he kind of missed the mark just as being the first black president to really, I don't know, address that issue. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this is something that Susan and I used to talk about in terms of we met him first in 2005, and then I remember her saying that she would say that he's not that progressive, right? I remember her saying that I remember saying to somebody, I was like, I think Obama is as progressive as you can possibly be and still get elected president as a black man in America.
Mm.
And so I think there's that. And then just the whole thing about the backlash, the refusal to acknowledge racism. So to even say that the police going into the home of probably the preeminent black scholar in the country at Harvard and arresting him was stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Huge backlash. And you had to have a whole beer summit around the whole, Henry Louis Gates thing, etc. So that shows how hard it was to do any of that. In some ways, I actually think that a white person or president can do more on this regard, kind of like Nixon going to China piece, because they're more inoculated. So, there's always more I think it could have or should have been done. But what's not going to happen, and certainly didn't happen from 2009 to 2016, is no teachers in Los Angeles said to their students that you can't be president because you're not black.
Yeah, that's true. Now, I'm curious, like, so you and I both recognize that minorities don't do as well financially, socially, what have you, than say like our white counterparts. But you yourself is probably an outlier. You're successful. I'm assuming you're not poor. I do okay. I don't make money off podcasting. I have a day job, but I consider myself somewhat successful. And I know people that will point to yourself, point to me, and say, yeah, like how can black people be doing so poorly? Like, just look at Steve, look at Will, like black people aren't as bad as they want us to believe. So like, what do you say to something like that?
Well, it's I'm trying to think, like, what's like the right. I went to see. This is probably not the right answer to this, but I remember seeing Dick Gregory speak when I was in college, and he came to speak at Stanford, and I was down there, and he says that so we always have to set our best to deal with their worst, and he says true equality would be when we get to be mediocre also, right? And so, and if you can take the not exactly the racial piece, but in terms of the racial voting part, I mean, to look at the Georgia Senate election, and so you have a sitting United States senator, the literal heir to Martin Luther King, in terms of Raphael Warnock, running against one of the least qualified, most scandal-ridden candidates probably to ever run for Senate, in terms of Herschel Walker. Didn't even live in Georgia to start with. Had been a football player 40 years ago. Multiple domestic violence incidents, not just allegations, holding a gun to his ex-wife's head, multiple unacknowledged children, and yet 80+% of white evangelicals voted against the minister, right? And so,
I know.
And Walker almost won that race. So the mountain for African Americans to be able to get to some level of success is so much higher. And so you can't just point to, oh, well, those people scaled the mountain, whereas other people don't have a mountain at all, right? In terms of being able to move in that regard. So I would say that, and then I would fundamentally look at just some fundamental, like, statistical realities. And so for one is this issue around the racial wealth gap, and would push people on this. So I was at Ben Carson when he was running for president 2016, conservative black feminist, and he was talking about well, my mom was poor but she worked hard, and so she didn't, take government handouts. And I always wanted to ask him, why was your mother poor? Right? Was she lazy? Is that how she got into poverty?
Mm-hmm.
But if you push it, then it's a legacy of slavery and then the post slavery segregation and economic. So why is that a acceptable starting point that we have to start in that point? I try to break this down like my first book, Brown's the New White, about it would take like a few hundred years if you take the racial wealth gap and the amount of assets that African Americans have and the amount of assets that whites have, and you just put it into the stock market, would never catch up. And so how do you actually kind of factor in that regard? And then you just look at all these different situations in terms of hiring and even all these different like tech companies that sprang up from scratch, and they're like largely and dominant white. And then you look at the Fortune 500, how few of them are actually run by different people of color. And I like to push people on the gender front in terms of like the amount of venture capital money that goes to female-headed firms. It's like 5% or something in that realm. Whereas women are the majority of people in the country. And so then you can only draw two conclusions: that women just aren't interested in starting and running companies, or that, I guess two things, that they're not good at it, and they're far worse and less talented than people than men, or you have to acknowledge that there's some bias in the system. And so I think comparing 5% to 3% can help people get there. And if you think there's some bias in the system towards women, then why wouldn't you acknowledge that there's some bias in the system towards people of color? And then that explains the racial wealth gap, which you can't unexplain by pointing to a small number of success stories of people who scaled a higher mountain. It doesn't mean that the system is accessible and fair and works for people.
So my last question to you, and I definitely appreciate all your input. This has been great. The time's actually kind of flown by. What's the roadmap to change the racial inequality narrative in this country, or is there a roadmap?
So I would say two things to it. For one is, I talk about how I describe in my book how there's been a Confederate battle plan, so how they've continued to fight for this to be a white nationalist country. The second half of my book, I talk about there's a liberation battle plan, and it's 5 case studies of places that have transformed, certainly politically, over the past 10 to 20 years. And so fundamentally, the core elements of that are finding and backing what I call level 5 leaders. And so it's people like Stacey Abrams, it's people like Tran Nguyen in Virginia, runs New Virginia Majority, who are personally humble but extraordinarily ferociously dedicated towards doing the work and building an organization and making a difference. Finding and supporting civic engagement organizations that expand the electorate. And so that's what all of these places have done. So it happened in Georgia, it's happened in Virginia, et cetera. And then making sure those organizations have detailed data-driven plans and are playing the long game. So fundamentally, it's about expanding democracy to get this to be a multiracial country so that its public policy priorities are focused on meeting the needs of the majority of people. And you know that's a key to changing the country by the ferocity with which the right wing is trying to suppress people from voting. Everything that expands voting, they try to tamp that down. So fundamentally, it's about getting as many people as possible to vote. And so that, to me, is what has led to the getting off of the white nationalist track we were on under Trump, right? So like I say, my wife was the first supporter of Stacey Abrams in 2012. We supported her for a decade. She came to us in 2013. It says there's 1.5 million unregistered people of color in Georgia. I'm going to go register them to vote. And that's the work that she did methodically, and that's what led to Georgia flipping in the presidential race, to which Biden was like, that's not one we expected. And that's what led to increasing the electorate, to flipping the whole United States Senate. So all the public policies coming out of the government have been far more progressive than they otherwise would have been. But all of it comes back to finding the leaders, building the organizations, and increasing the number of people who are voting. That, to me, is the fundamental piece. Then we will get to have the elected officials who want this to be a multiracial democracy and advance and protect policies to have that occur.
Wow, that sounds like a pretty good game plan. And I hope we're successful in 2024. So I guess we will see. But yeah, thank you so much, Steve, for spending some time with us. Where can people follow your work, check out your book?
So democracyincolor.com is the it's a multiracial progressive media organization I created. We do a weekly newsletter every week. We do a podcast every 2 weeks, Democracy in Color with Steve Phillips. So you can find out about all that at democracyincolor.com. You can sign up to get on our newsletter at democracyincolor.com. And that's the best way to stay in touch with what we're up to.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thank you again. This has been super enlightening, educational for me. I really appreciate your time. This has been great. So thank you to all of our listeners and our viewers. And yeah, we'll see you next week. Take care.